one evening, something happened to me which frightened me ever since. And it was simply that I walked into a restaurant where I knew I would not be served. And, but I walked in with the determination to be served or to die.
Yeah.
I was not going to be told any more the Negroes can't eat here.
Yeah.
Unless, something, make something else happen. And I waited. I wasn't served, of course. The woman said, poor little girl, said that Negroes were not served here. And I wanted to kill her, but I couldn't get close enough to her, so I threw a glass of water at her. And when the glass of water hit the mirror behind the bar, I woke up suddenly, and I ran out of the restaurant, and I somehow got home. I never forgot it because it was the first time in my life that I ever wanted really to hurt anybody. I had been, I'd had fights at school and all that, but I'd never in my life before really wanted to destroy another human being. And I haven't in the main since, but I certainly did then. It was a terrible turning point in my life because it was the first time that the whole business of being black had really driven me to such a place. But at that moment, too, I began to realize that it was not so important to be black because I could do one or two things. I could die if I believed what white people said about me, or I could take it all and change it.
The American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s had few figureheads more prominent than James Baldwin, and certainly few more gifted in their use of language. Physically, he was not imposing, but as a force for change, he was awesome. His writing encapsulated the racial tensions within American society, and readers of all races were, and continue to be, bowled over by his novels, poems, essays, and plays.
One writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that order which is art. The difficulty then for me of being a Negro writer was the fact that I was, in effect, prohibited from examining my own experience too closely by the tremendous demands and the very real dangers of my social situation.
Born out of wedlock on the 2nd of August 1924, James never met his natural father. His mother, Emma Berdice Jones, was married 3 years later to David Baldwin, a clergyman, and the family settled in New York's Harlem.
Well, Harlem in the 20s, when Baldwin was growing up, was a very different place than it is now. In the first place, it wasn't all African American. It was a much more integrated kind of place. Baldwin talked about the fact that one of his earliest neighbors that he remembers was an Italian boy about his age with whom he was good friends. But more important than that, even in the black community in Harlem, there was much more of a sense of family or of community. For instance, Mrs. Jones knew what Mrs. Smith's boy was doing out in the streets and could feel free to let him know that he shouldn't be doing that if he was doing something wrong, or send him home to his mother. There was a sense of community, a sense of cooperation. Baldwin's mother, who was always called Berdice, who still is called Berdice, she's alive and well, was a wonderfully supportive mother to all of her children. And I think Jimmy felt a special connection to her because of the fact that the Reverend David Baldwin was not actually his father, so naturally he felt particularly close to his mother.
Although the Reverend Baldwin adopted James, relations between the two were strained. His mother, on the other hand, was passionately affectionate towards him, instilling in him at a very early age a sense of destiny.
"You getting to be," she said, putting her hand beneath his chin and holding his face away from her, "a right big boy. You gonna be a mighty fine man, you know that? Your mama's counting on you." And he knew again that she was not saying everything she meant. In a kind of secret language, she was telling him today something that he must remember and understand tomorrow.
He had a great deal of difficulty getting along with his stepfather, who was a very demanding person and perhaps somewhat arbitrary in the way he brought up the children. So I think there was always a lot of tension between Baldwin and his stepfather, whom, by the way, he never called his stepfather. He always called him his father. It was the only father he knew. And in a way, he loved his father very much, too. Or like a lot of children who feel somewhat deprived, he wanted to be recognized by him and wanted his talents to be recognized by him, and wasn't always successful in getting his father to recognize those talents.
He was much prouder than anyone I've ever met in my life since, and I suppose I may go to my grave without ever meeting anybody quite so rigid.
I mean, give me an instance.
Well, he came north. He wanted to, it wasn't so much that he wanted to be white, but he wanted to make, he wanted Negroes to do, in effect, what he imagined white people did. That is to own the houses, to own U.S. Steel, to, in fact, in a word, he wanted power. And the terms of his life were such that the only way he could achieve it was in that very narrow frame of reference involved with Southern and Northern churches. And this is what, in effect, killed him, because there was something in him which could not bend. He could only be broken.
His father was God's minister, the ambassador of the King of Heaven. And John could not bow before the throne of grace without first kneeling to his father. On his refusal to do this, had his life depended.
While the Reverend constricted the young James with unyielding dogma, his young primary school teacher, Arilla Miller, exerted a creative influence on him.
She was a great help to him and a very important influence because at a very early age, this was at the grade school age, she recognized in Baldwin a very special person and got to know his family and took a real interest in his life, not just his academic life, but his personal life, took him to, and his cultural life. She introduced him really to perhaps some more social activism that he'd been introduced to in his own household. She was left-wing. She took him to union meetings with she and her later husband. They did all sorts of things to build up his social consciousness. They also took him to plays. They were great theater fans, and they also were movie fans, and they helped contribute to his interest in movies, which was a lifelong interest. She also, as he always said, taught him just by being herself that it wasn't necessary for him to hate all white people, although he had plenty of good reason to.
Theater going was forbidden in our house, but with the really cruel intuitiveness of a child, I suspected that the color of this woman's skin would carry the day for me. When at school she suggested taking me to the theater, I did not, as I might have done if she had been a Negro, find a way of discouraging her, but agreed that she should pick me up at my house one evening.
When it came time for Baldwin to go to high school, he applied to and was accepted at a public school, that is a state school, called DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, which meant that he would have to take quite a long subway ride each day to get there. But it was a very good school. It was a very special school in the sense that it encouraged learning. And also he met teachers in that school who encouraged his writing.
Attracted by the worlds of art and literature, and conscious of the racial prejudice which so often meant that black Americans were worse off than their white contemporaries, the young Baldwin was developing several often conflicting ambitions. But his overbearing father decided on the path that he would follow.
And I went into the church, partly because I'd been driven there all my life, and my father had always determined that I would be a preacher. I'd always said I wouldn't be, but life outwitted me, and corroborated him. Because at that point in my life, there was no place for me to go. I had no intention ever of becoming a preacher or of entering that terrifying church, which I spent nearly 14 years by that time trying to get out of. But I was so afraid of everything else that in a way I ended up with the devil I knew, though I couldn't have said it then.
What actually was the name of the church? What kind of church was it?
We moved from church to church, but it was, it's Pentecostal faith, which is just an elegant way to describe a kind of small Baptist sect.
Yes.
It was apostolic. It's what we call in New York Holy Rollers.
During Baldwin's high school years, he obviously was developing sexually too, and developing sexual interests. and he sensed that his primary sexual interest, though not his exclusive one, was a homosexual interest. And this bothered him. He had grown up, not only was he black and illegitimate, now he was going to find out that he was gay. This was maybe a little bit too much, and he was afraid of it. Naturally, this did set up a kind of conflict in his own life, because he was living one life at DeWitt Clinton High School, a life that stressed social activism, left-wing politics, that stressed writing and changing the world by the pen and by demonstrations and various other ways. But meanwhile, back in Harlem at home, he was living in a very religious household, and he was a boy preacher.
Baldwin knew that just beyond the margins of his father's straight-laced legacy was a world of vivid spontaneity. He described the attraction of this other world in his autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain.
And the whole discovery that the boy I called John made that summer he was 14, is very much like the kind of discoveries that I and many other Negro boys and girls made on similar summers, especially in northern cities, and had to do with the way all the jazz, which I was raised but forbidden to listen to. That is to say, my father's house was holy, but the houses next door were not.
Yes.
And they drank gin, and they had all-night parties, and one heard cursing and a whole sense of life all around you, which was supposed to be very dangerous.
By 16, Baldwin was disillusioned with the life of a preacher. He moved to New York's Greenwich Village, then a hotbed of bohemian activity. It was there he met the painter Buford Delaney.
Baldwin went down to see him on the advice of his classmate. It must have been in about 1940, when he was about 15 or 16. And he walked into Buford's world, and it was really a revelation, because here was a man who, like him, was gay, and that became evident really quickly. Like him was black, and like him was a student of the arts. And here was a successful black painter living in Greenwich Village in 1940. Buford taught him things like, that it was, yes, gospel music was fine, but it was also okay to like jazz. You see, jazz was associated in the young preacher's mind with the evils of Saturday night in Harlem. And Buford was saying to him, this is our music too, and this is beautiful too. And you can listen to both. You can listen to gospel and you can listen to jazz. And he taught him about light and about looking at things carefully, not just to look at the surface, but to probe and to find the patterns inside of things, to find the beauty even in things that are seemingly ugly. In 1948, Baldwin was really fed up with New York and with the United States in general. Yes, he was living in the village, and yes, he had white friends and black friends and was living a kind of bohemian life. But it was a life that was always marred by a kind of racist pressure. Well, there was a whole tradition of African Americans going to Paris, where they were much more openly received than they were in their own country. There were jazz musicians, and most important, most recently, there was Richard Wright, who had got him the grant that made it possible for him to go to Paris. And he admired Wright, although he didn't agree with everything that Wright did or with Wright's approach to writing necessarily, but he admired him. And it seemed obvious that a good place for him to try to go would be Paris, and so he did.
Well, actually, it was the most exciting time in Paris, probably since the 20s. But he wasn't necessarily immediately part of that society. And this is the time of the great left bank society of Sartre and de Beauvoir and Boris Vian and Camus and Jean Genet. And they were all clustered in left bank cafes. But he didn't have the language for a start, and he didn't have any money. And of course, he didn't have any entree into that society, except for the novelist Richard Wright, who was a mentor of his, and Richard Wright looked after him to a certain extent. But it wasn't long before they quarreled. The strictly literal explanation for it was an article which Baldwin published called Everybody's Protest Novel, which was really about Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. But it ended with a coda on Richard Wright and his novel Native Son, which Baldwin drew into his highly critical overview of the protest novel.
Below the surface of this novel there lies, as it seems to me, a continuation, a complement of that monstrous legend it was written to destroy. The failure of the protest novel lies in its rejection of life, the human being, the denial of his beauty, dread, power, in its insistence that it is his categorization alone which is real and which cannot be transcended.
Richard Wright read the article and didn't like it, and he told Baldwin so, and he said to Baldwin, all literature is protest. And Baldwin, according to him, replied, all literature may be protest, but all protest isn't literature. And that was a crushing remark. And of course he would have retracted that later, because I think he probably did admire the novel Native Son in many aspects, but one way or another, Wright was on the way out and Baldwin was on the way in.
This period of introspection helped Baldwin find his writing voice, but he still craved acceptance and companionship. Above all, he craved love.
Being in Paris was a kind of limbo. I didn't know anybody here. I didn't have any money. I didn't speak any French. I was, completely, absolutely on my own, and lived in a kind of silence for more than a year, because if you don't speak a language, you can't, there's no communication, there's no back and forth. And in that silence, I began to learn something about myself. I was thrown back on whatever it was I really came from, whatever the language was that I really had spoken when I was very young, when I was a little boy. The music that produced me, and the church. All of that became, in a way, became new, for me, in the isolation world, which was, my life in Paris.
I think it was 1952. While he was working on the novel that would become Go Tell It on the Mountain, he met a young Swiss man called Lucien Happersberger, who was, I think he would say, a street boy in Paris at that time. And they struck up a friendship. They were both very poor. They immediately liked each other, and in a certain sense, I suppose, fell in love with each other. Lucien, for the rest of Jimmy's life, was really a model of the possibility of love, the possibility of a secure domestic life. It didn't work that way, as it turned out, because Lucien didn't feel quite the same way. Lucien was not ready to be committed to a totally homosexual relationship. He married several times and had a life of his own. So he was always a source of great frustration for Baldwin, but he also was always his main lover, if you see what I mean.
Well, I think he had a very idealistic view of love. He held it as an ideal. And, he would see it where it didn't really exist, I think. I mean, he was a visionary person, really. So he would see the beauty in people, which, not to be unkind, but no one else could see.
During the 1950s, Baldwin made several trips back to America. It was on one such visit in 1957 that he journeyed for the first time to the southern states, where his ancestors had worked as slaves. The experience made a lasting impression on him.
What he found there, even though he knew intellectually about it, was emotionally a real revelation. And he was horrified by what he found there. He was also uplifted by what he found there in what gradually became the student movement for the liberation of blacks in the South. And he did meet Martin Luther King, for example, and this was very important to him. He met him fairly early on and saw what a magnetic kind of person he was and how important he would be for the movement. So really, the trips to the South were a kind of a continuation of his education in racial politics in America.
I grew up sort of really just as the sort of civil rights laws were really sort of taking effect in the United States. And so I'm probably, among a last generation of black kids who really grew up in a kind of, insular black community. I mean, a sort of a full and really functioning black community. And I think that in that world, I mean, as in the world of Baldwin's work, I mean, there was a sense that it was a black experience, but it was also a sense that it was very much an American experience. And I think that the thing that struck me most about Baldwin's work was just this sense of recognition, that he knew about the same streets that I lived in. He was writing about a church experience that was very familiar to me, and the sort of history of how black people who were now living in urban centers were immigrants from the American South.
By the late 1950s, Baldwin's writing had been noticed. Several magazines had published his essays and short stories, and his novels, Go Tell It on the Mountain and Giovanni's Room, were now in print.
I think that what Baldwin was a very powerful voice. I don't think there really was any other kind of voice like Baldwin's during the civil rights movement. Again, going back to earliest memories of Baldwin on television, I can remember being really young and seeing him on some show saying things like, the bill is in America and you've made no provision to pay. And it was quite clear to me that he was both angry about this state of affairs, that he also thought it was amusing, and that he had every intention of thriving whether or not America came down on the right side of the race question, in a way that I just think he had a kind of boldness and sort of ferocity that somebody like Martin Luther King couldn't have. Baldwin was an intellectual, but I also think that he gave a certain voice to to the civil rights movement that no one else brought to the table.
His second novel was Giovanni's Room, which the American publishers at first refused to have anything to do with because they said it's difficult enough that you're a black novelist, but now you're going to be a gay black novelist. This is just too much. And it was actually an English publisher, Michael Joseph, Michael Joseph himself, who agreed to publish this and any other book that Jimmy ever wrote.
Sometimes in the days which are coming, in the glare of the gray morning, sour-mouthed, eyelids raw and red, hair tangled and damp from my stormy sleep, facing over coffee and cigarette smoke, last night's impenetrable, meaningless boy who will shortly rise and vanish like the smoke. I will see Giovanni again, as he was that night, so vivid, so winning, all of the light of that gloomy tunnel trapped around his head.
I think that with Giovanni's Room, Baldwin attracted another audience, a homosexual audience, and these people then tended to expect that he would go on writing homosexual novels. But what happens when we get to the third novel, Another Country, is that we get a combination, and in that novel we find out what Baldwin is really talking about, namely the cost to anybody, black, white, gay, straight, of denying who he or she is. The real price you pay, for instance, the real price that David in Giovanni's Room pays for denying what he is, for denying his own sexuality. And this has an analogous connection to the whole question of race. Baldwin's main concern was the whole question of recognizing who you are. and not pretending to be something else.
When I was a student, an undergraduate student, I had an opportunity to meet James Baldwin. And, you know, there were lots of sort of old friends coming in and out. And he sort of was sitting in the living room in this sort of African sort of child's chair. It looked like this sort of child's throne. And, you know, he had all these rings on his finger. And, you know, I was very, very, very impressed to be, you know, sitting in a living room in New York. It was like something that would happen in one of his novels, you know, that I would have an opportunity to be, you know, having this sort of audience with James Baldwin. He was very different from the Baldwin that I'd seen, grew up seeing on television. He was far more effeminate in his self-presentation, in private, it seemed to me, than he was when he was sort of speaking with this sort of public meta voice, you know, sort of speaking, I mean, often sort of taking on kind of the rhetorical pose of sort of speaking for all black people in America.
By the early 1960s, Baldwin was famous both as a gifted author and as a campaigner for the rights of black Americans. Following the publication of Another Country in 1962, the BBC profiled his life and works.